Hello, hello, dear DLD community. Once again, welcome to our DLD Sync. It's the 12th or 13th DLD Sync, and it's a super session today. As you know, as many of you know, that DLD has always to do is a kind of chain reaction. Some weeks ago, Hans Ulrich Obrist, my good friend, the curator of the Serpentine Gallery, spoke at DLD Sync with Brian Eno. And Brian Eno recommended him to speak urgently with Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana Mazzucato is a superstar for me, and not only to me. I'm chasing her since years. I met her first at the Economic Business Summit in Brussels. And then I went to the stage and said, Maya, I'm doing DLD. Maybe you want to speak there? And she said, oh, I'm so busy, I can't come. But I was so impressed by her that I again tried to chase her at the DLD, at the TED conference in Edinburgh. And she gave a wonderful speech there. You should see her TED talk there. She really, as an economist professor, she has different views. She has timely views on how our society is changing along these times, along these inventions, along this amazing sea change of our world. She really made her point. She is the best-selling author of The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myth, and the Value of Everything, Making and Taking the Global Economy. Her big topic is, and this goes aligned with Hans Ulrich, is the mission capitalism. Our purpose, are we in a purpose-driven society? Should we be in it? How can we act? How can we change things? All these things. I'm so happy that they both talk to each other now at DLD Sync. It's really a dream for me came true. It's so important to have these two voices together. It will be a sparkling conversation. And thank you both for coming, Mariana Mazzucato and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you so much, Steffi. And thank you so much, Mariana, for accepting our invitation, which really started thanks to Brian Eno, because we are working at the Serpentine on a project called Back to Earth with 50 artist campaign, environmental campaigns this year and next year. And Brian knew that I'm very fascinated and inspired by your books, and said that it would be so great we could do a talk. And he actually also sent me a question for you, Mariana, which we're going to ask at the end, a special question from Brian Eno. So I've got lots of questions. I wanted, before starting, also to wish Steffi a very happy birthday. It's Steffi Czerny's birthday today. Happy birthday, Steffi, and thanks, as always, to the DLD team.
Well,
happy birthday.
I love you, Hans Ulrich, as you know. I love you very, very much. You changed my life, too.
Happy birthday, Steffi. Thank
Happy
you.
birthday.
Mariana, before we talk about the current moment and the future, I wanted to ask you about the beginnings. I wanted to ask you how you became an economist, if there was an epiphany, who were your influences at the beginning? Yeah, to begin with the beginning.
That's a great question. So I studied history in my undergraduate course, and I was especially interested in labor history. And as sort of a side thing, as one does, I was working with some trade unions, so labor unions in Boston, which is where I was studying. And I was working with two trade unions that were having real difficulties in terms of kind of the conditions of production, one would call it, but also in getting union membership seen kind of as a human right that one can choose or not choose, to be part of the union. And this was the laundry workers union and the hotel workers union. And through that work which eventually became actually about organizing, helping workers actually organize themselves into trade unions, I realized how little I understood about the economy and how so many of the issues they were confronting in terms of their daily, let's just call it struggles, had to do with also, for example, how technological change was being introduced, the degree to which workers had any sort of voice. And I realized that my history degree wasn't enough. And so I decided to focus my master's and then PhD in a particular place in the US, which is called the Graduate Faculty of the New School, which really encourages thinking about different models of the economy. Because often what happens in economics departments is there's one traditional kind of way of thinking about the economy, and then anything else is seen as a history, kind of history of economic thought. You're not actually presented different kind of models of value, different theories of value, different ways of thinking about the economy. And this particular place did that. And the reason I was very interested in that was because I realized that one of the biggest concerns of working people was actually how they were kind of being subjected to what was being seen as the laws of the economy, taking out any sort of agency that they might have. And I should also say that all my friends at university were worried about other countries. You know, this was the time of apartheid, the time, I don't know if you remember, it depends how old you are, the Sandinistas and the Contras, you know, in Central America. And so my kind of interest in working with the trade unions in Boston was my urge to kind of get more grounded on the US soil in terms of key progressive topics. And again, I found myself very unarmed in terms of understanding some of the key issues that workers were interested in, which had to do with the economy. And I decided then to focus on that. That was a very long answer. I promise to be shorter.
No, thank you. This is a great beginning. And you mentioned in previous interviews the importance of the New School for Social Research as the only place where you could actually study alternative economics, and also that we cannot reform without actually reforming economic theory. And that was really about the New School for Social Research. Can you tell us what's so special about the New School for Social Research?
Well, so it's a graduate faculty of the New School. It was actually where a lot of the scholars from the Frankfurt School in Germany went to when they had to leave Germany due to the Nazi regime. And it's always been a place where philosophers, economists, and sociologists kind of met to, in some ways, rethink society. I don't know if you know the work of course, Agnes Heller, of course, Hannah Arendt, and kind of her thinking influenced very much the work of Agnes Heller. But in terms of the economy side, the people that aggregated there, that came to the graduate faculty of the New School, they were Marxists, there was Keynesians, post-Keynesian, neo-Ricardians, as well as some traditional kind of neoclassical economists, and this very explicit welcoming of different ideas of how the economy works, underlying assumptions about, again, value theory, I found very, refreshing there. And the person who recommended that I go there was actually one of my few economics teachers during my undergrad, even though I was a history major, Philip Murawski, because he wrote a book that was fascinating. He said that economics is very mathematical. And so many young people who are trying to rethink the economy think they have to take out the math. And he said, be careful. What you really need is questioning which mathematics is being used in economic theory. And ironically, the kind of mathematics that's being used, it's still today, which is at the core of traditional economic thought, is basically mathematics that's come from Newtonian physics. You know, all the focus is on equilibria, averages, some sort of center of gravity. And the irony is that when economics was being pressured to seem very kind of scientific and more rigorous than the artists like yourselves or the sociologists, they ended up using this type of mathematics and physics, which the physicists were rejecting. So the physicists were increasingly going to things like quantum physics and actually really exploring the underlying uncertainty of the system that they were exploring. But the economists, who wanted to seem very rigorous like the physicists, were going to the old mathematics and physics. And so that woke me up to the fact that the methods we use, literally which equations, which type of mathematics we use, is not neutral. So in economics, the interesting thing was they ended up choosing, it's almost against the scientific method, right? So the scientific method would be, what am I looking at? What do I want to understand, whether it's the stars in the system or why it is that you have so many companies going into a sector and then so many dying after just 5 years. And then you ask, what tools should I use to study that system? Instead, the economics process was, what do I want to already prove? So if I want to prove that capitalism is the best possible system, that it is, equilibrating towards some center of gravity types of forces, what's the best mathematics that I can use? Well, of course, Newtonian physics. But they already knew what they wanted to prove. That was his thesis. And so the non-neutrality of our mathematics is a very important thing to keep in mind today, when the rethinking economic movement, unfortunately, sometimes ends up being a kind of user-friendly movement. Let's make economics easier. Take out the maths and a lot of discussion. That's dangerous if we don't, along the way, debunk the underlying assumptions about things like equilibria, whether averages matter, etc. Again, I'm giving you very long answers.
No, I'm grateful. Thank you. And actually, Steffi mentioned, of course, your own institute. You're the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that, and also, of course, which brings us then to the extreme present, what are the most interesting issues you're exploring right now at your institute?
So this is very dangerous. If I already gave you long answers to the other one, this is going to be like a 2-day monologue. But I promise to keep it short. So I'm very excited about the institute. First of all, it's a department. So it's a department inside of University College London. And by department, I mean we have our own teaching program. So we can rewrite the curriculum. The worst thing for me would be to found a center into a traditional economics department. So I'd have to be serving a problematic narrative and framing even of what the curriculum should be about. So we have huge freedom. But the reason I set it up is that I've been working for the last 10 years, actually, on this concept of rethinking the state, so the public sector, not because I think the public sector is any more important than any other sector, but because it's been so understood, under-theorized, under-imagined. And I think that all the problems we have today, you know, like the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, and the 169 targets below them require a complete reimagination of what is possible and a new type of interaction between public, private, and civil society. And the problem with the state is that in economics, at least, we've pretended. Is that you making all this noise?
No, I don't know where it comes from. There was somebody who rang my doorbell, so I'm sorry for that. But the second noise,
I might have a builder come in soon too, but I'll ignore him. And so this idea that at best the state can fix a market failure, yeah, and can enable or facilitate the value that's created in business, that's created a very problematic type of partnership, or one could use the word ecosystem, between public and private. And so I set up the Institute really to be able to implement some of the ideas that I've been writing about in the entrepreneurial state work. That was one of the books I wrote. And the key thesis around the entrepreneurial state was that all the big innovations in our lifetime, but even before that, like the internet revolution, would never have happened without active risk-taking state investments. And this wasn't helicopter money thrown down on stuff. There was real missions. There was a purpose, right? So the internet came about because the US Department of Defense needed the satellites to communicate, and the internet was one of the solutions that kind of allowed that to happen. Or GPS, touchscreen display, the Siri voice-activated system, all these things in our smartphones would never have come about without active, strategic, mission-oriented, risk-taking public sector institutions. And so the big theme is that if we want a green revolution, not just an internet revolution, we better understand how to really structure different types of public investments to foster that. But the reason I wanted to set up an institute and a department was to say this isn't just about spending or investing. We need to better understand the organizational features of public organizations that are able to take those risks, to invest, but also to engage with academia and civil society, to also ask the questions, what are the big problems of our time that those investments kind of require? And so in the Institute, we have the research and thought leadership side around issues like public value, public purpose. We have a training program focused on rethinking the curriculum for bureaucrats globally, trying to change the word bureaucratic, so it's a positive word. If you say that's so bureaucratic, it's like, that's so sexy. And then the policy engagement, we work very actively with policymakers around the world, helping them set up new institutions, like maybe a public bank, or new instruments, new rethinking procurement, how to redesign procurement to crowd in bottom-up solutions, and new types of ambitious mission-oriented innovation and industrial strategies focused on the big goals and getting lots of different actors in the economy to fuel solutions for that. And I feel very honored that the UCL gave me the opportunity to do that, because being able to both rewrite the curriculum for civil servants, work on the policies, and rethink the theory and have linkages between them is kind of a dream.
Now, also, I saw the amazing conversation you did with Christine Amanpour, and that, of course, brings us to question of now the economy during and after COVID-19. And you said something which resonated very much with also our Back to Earth research, because actually we've been, launching this Create Art for Earth campaign with Jane Fonda, her Friday Fridays, with Judith Chicago, and also with Swoon. And they said actually in that manifesto that it cannot be about going back to normal, because normal is extinction of the environment, normal is the destruction of the environment. So this is a moment for change. And you said a similar thing really in this conversation with Christine Amanpour. You said we have to remember that the concept of going back to normal only makes sense if normal was good. And given the levels of inequality we've had in different countries, given the climate crisis, we need to be imaginative and creative how we structure our remedies. Can you talk a little bit about how to structure the remedies?
Sure.
Because you advise, of course, governments, which is so fascinating that you go from theory to production of reality, so as to say, by advising. Just before we started the interview, you spoke to government. You speak every day to government. So it would be great to hear what you advise them.
Okay. Yeah, that's why I was late, but no one knows that, because I looked like I was on time. But that's why my hair is a bit disheveled. So first of all, just to be really clear, because I think it's important to be specific, otherwise it's like a cocktail hour as opposed to a guerrilla warfare, which I think it has to be. Why going back to normal is not okay is very specific. It's not just that, everything sucks. It's very specific. So we have a financial sector which has been financing itself. So something like 80% of the funds just in the UK go from finance, go back to finance, insurance, and real estate. The acronym is FIRE. We should tell Greta Thunberg, because she says the house is on fire. You wouldn't sit there and debate about climate change if your house was on fire. You'd get out and find a solution. The same thing with our economy. Finance is on fire, meaning it's been financing itself, finance, insurance, and real estate. That's a huge problem. The second issue is it's not that there's not enough finance going into the real economy. It's the real economy itself. So industry, the type of kind of, big companies in pharmaceuticals and energy and tech have become overly financialized, spending an increasing amount of their profits on areas like share buybacks, just boosting share prices, stock options, and executive pay. That's part of the whole kind of short-termism and focus just on quarterly returns problem. So finance and business are both messed up. And the state is also problematic because, again, as I was saying before, it sees its role at best as fixing the market failure, which means it actually has to wait for things to screw up before it comes in. So it's always kind of too little, too late. And of course, the fourth big problem is climate change, but I don't have to tell your audience why that's a massive crisis. And so really the issue is, how do we make sure that this pandemic that we're living through, and that is so hard for many of us, and we're kind of think we want the back to normal. I've got 4 kids at home. I definitely want them out of the house, back in school as soon as possible. How do we make sure that we structure the recovery, both in the immediate sense, the help, for example, that companies are receiving, in such a way that is still driven by a perception of what our long run vision is for the future. If we want sustainable growth, green growth, if we want inclusive growth, less inequality, innovation-led growth to stimulate as much bottom-up creativity as possible, how do we bring that to the everyday implementation of our thinking about the crisis? And just to give you 3 kind of examples, first of all, there's huge amounts of money, as you know, being poured in, just like we had with the financial crisis. And we need to learn the lesson of the crisis back in 2008 when, literally trillions was put in and it, kind of prevented massive financial speculation, but didn't actually solve the problem. Again, a lot of that money went back to finance. we need to make sure that the remedies that are being put in today, the billions that are being put in every country, are structured in such a way that really increase the capacity of our system to deal with the next crisis. That means both making sure that we're properly funding, resourcing public health systems, or let's just call it the welfare state, not a very sexy word, but it should be. The welfare state is absolutely critical to making sure that many people have the basic kind of human rights in terms of all the different services, whether it's education or health and other that they need, but these services have been undervalued, under-resourced, and we need to rethink why that is. And the pandemic wakes us up to that, because we know that we're only as healthy as our neighbors, as on our street, in our city, in our nation, and globally. And so strengthening global health systems is a massive lesson, and all this money going into the system, if it's not going to strengthen global health systems, well, that's going to be a huge mistake. But secondly, many sectors, as you know, I'm sure your galleries are suffering. Many sectors are hurting and need money from the government. But many of these sectors have also been part of the problem. So take airlines. We're not flying planes, thank God. That's one of the good things. I'm home much more. But we should be structuring the bailouts to the automotive industry, to the steel industry, to the airline industry in such a way that actually contains conditions attached to make sure that these sectors are slowly becoming part of the solution, not part of the problem. And here it's been fascinating how some countries, like in France and Denmark and even Austria, have really been quite ambitious with those conditions. So Air France or Renault, the car company in France, have not been able to get help from the government unless they committed to reducing their carbon emissions. Whereas EasyJet here in the UK, massive bailout, no conditions attached. In Denmark, there was conditions attached to companies not being able to use tax havens. If they use tax havens, no money coming from the government. And Elizabeth Warren in the US has been putting on the table that companies that are excessively using share buybacks that I was mentioning before shouldn't be able to access state money. And this is really kind of on my third point. I think this is the opportunity to walk the talk of stakeholder capitalism. I don't know about you, but I was unfortunately in Davos this year, and all that was being talked about was purpose and stakeholder capitalism, but very little has changed. And this is the moment where there's a lot of public money going in to say, what would a stakeholder governance of the system look like if during a pandemic, when the public sector is asked to come in big time, that we structured, these relationships in a new way that really was about public purpose, common purpose, or the common good, as the Vatican likes to talk about it. And we're working very closely with the Vatican actually on this. And if we can't do it with the conditionalities attached to the bailouts, then stop talking that talk. Just admit it that you just kind of want a free ride and do your shareholder value maximization. Lastly, just really quickly, one of the big lessons is on state capacity. So in many countries, like in the UK, where so much of the state capacity has been outsourced to the private sector, there's nothing wrong with that as long as the state is still investing in its own capabilities and dynamic capabilities and capacity to govern. But what we've seen in countries like the UK, again, is overly outsourcing to companies like Serco, G4S, which you'll remember was supposed to do the security for the London Olympics, then failed. The military had to come in, but also to Deloitte, so the consulting companies having a huge share of government contracts to deliver things, including testing during COVID. That has over time also decreased government's own capacity to learn, to invest, to govern. And so we really, I hope, realize that this is a call for government institutions to be as capable, dynamic, value-creating as private sector institutions, but especially to relate one to another in a more functional, symbiotic way. And it's very interesting to see how Vietnam or Kerala, the state of Kerala in India, actually were quite successful in their response to COVID-19, very much as a result of their historic investment in state capacity, unlike some other countries which have unfortunately given into the kind of outsourcing and privatization trend.
Now, one thing which I think is super urgent to talk about is your point about the mission-driven governments, because you analyzed that it's something we could observe, I think, so clearly, it's never been so clear before than during this COVID time, that actually mission-driven governments have fared much better than governments without the mission. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that. And I think you've also prepared some images about the clean ocean to kind of show the mission-oriented approach. So it would be great to see that.
So first I'll explain it, and then your IT helper can bring it on. So first, the idea is that so many policies are just handouts. You know, we have like criteria like the size of a company, you know, SMEs, small, medium enterprises, as though size is the thing to worry about. Or some countries will have an industrial strategy based on a list of sectors, right? So the UK used to be worried about, let me see if I can remember them, life sciences, aerospace, automobiles, creative industries, and financial services. So again, a list of top sectors. Holland had their top sectors. And my point to the European Commission, which is where I kind of developed this work on missions, which was actually then voted on. You always have to be careful when you do something that then people vote on, by the Parliament and the Council, was to say, look, you really need to think in a moonshot way, which goes beyond the sector and beyond the size of the company or public and private. You need big goals, like getting the plastic out of the ocean, right? Let's say that that's the goal. The next question is, how do you bring as many different sectors to the table to actually facilitate? Well, this is the problem when you do a talk and then your children and husbands start coming in. How do you then facilitate that kind of bottom-up innovation across as many different sectors as possible that allow you to actually solve that problem? So let me just make this simpler. The moonshot that we were celebrating just last year was, of course, literally the moon landing, right? Getting a man to the moon and back again in one generation. That came from a challenge, which at the time was the Cold War, Sputnik, the space race. But had they just stopped there saying, we got to beat the Russians, they would have never gotten to the moon. They actually had to say, we're going to go to the moon and back again in one generation, and then catalyze and inspire as much different activity across the economy to get there. And that occurred through innovation, not just in aeronautics, but also nutrition. They couldn't just eat hamburgers and hot dogs up there. In textiles, they couldn't just wear jeans and a t-shirt. In materials, electronics, the whole software industry was a spillover of that moonshot. And then if you go down further, besides this cross-sectoral aspect, there was a real attention to how do you design, kind of bringing design thinking, how do you design something that could sound really boring, like procurement policy, which is government as purchaser, because governments purchase a lot of stuff. So how do you redesign procurement to really kind of nurture as much bottom-up experimentation with solving the goal? So the way that NASA interacted with the private sector was by setting kind of really clear outcomes they needed, but then saying, and how you do it is up to you. And so using procurement to drive through bottom-up innovation towards solving particular things that the government needs to solve a problem, whether it's a green problem, a health problem, a big IT problem, can really foster that bottom-up innovation. So if you bring up the slide now, there you go, yay! So the idea is that you begin with one of the SDGs. So this is the SDG 14 around clean oceans. Make it really specific, get the plastic out. This is one of the ones that I worked on with the European Commission in a report that I wrote on missions. So very specific, reduction of 90% of plastics entering the marine environment and collection of more than half of the plastics present in our oceans by 2025. That would involve many different sectors from design, marine, chemicals. But then the question is, how do you make sure that the grants, the loans, the procurement contracts, and all the different things that government has at its disposal in terms of the levers to tilt the playing field, not level the playing field, tilt it towards the direction of helping us solve big goals? How do you do that in such a way that really fosters innovation and creativity? Because if it's too top down, you'll stifle innovation. So it's this really tense relationship between top down, kind of clear directions of what we're trying to do, and think of the 17 SDGs as being the big challenges underneath of which there might be different missions, and then really redesigning industrial strategy, innovation policy to get as many different sectors involved, and then that bottom-up experimentation, which means really redoing government, because unfortunately lots of what government currently does turns more into subsidy, a guarantee, some sort of handout, with very few kind of ways to design how we're going to really work together in that stakeholder way to solve big public problems. You can take off this slide now.
Thank you. Now, what is interesting is also because we talked about bailouts and you talked about the necessity to attach strings to these bailouts, but you also talked about long durational dimension, that we need, it's a moment to think about the long-term vision. And the French historian Fernand Braudel calls it the necessity to think about la longue durée, the long duration. Now, in 2008, I spoke, around 2008-9, I spoke to Helen Levitt, who was then in her 90s, the photographer. And she sort of said, rather than to talk about bailouts only, one should actually revisit the moment of the New Deal, the Roosevelt New Deal, because that was something which went over many years. It was about how to put in place a democratic and also a decentralized government patronage, particularly in art. It was very relevant for my field, for the arts, of course, and lots of public art programs were actually installed between 33 and 42. So over many years, tens of thousands of artists were employed. It was a democratic government art patronage. It was decentralized. It encouraged a lot of emerging talent. It increased the general public, appreciation of the art. It built bridges. It also promoted actually a closer interrelation of the artists with the local environment. So it was very long durational as an approach. So I was wondering, as an economist, how you see this idea of a New Deal for now, the reference to Roosevelt, and also the idea of a Green New Deal, because of course Jeremy Rifkin wrote the book The Green New Deal in 2019.
Right. So I mean, those are all such huge, and important questions, because it has to do both with the quantity of finance, because there was a lot of money actually thrown at the New Deal. It wasn't just talk. They really put their money where their mouth was, but also the long-termism, as you mentioned, a real long-term vision. So the long-termism, but also the vision itself. So long-termism on its own could just be long-termism to do something really boring, but a real vision for what it meant to restructure society. And I think on all three of those levels right now, we have a problem. There's not enough finance actually going into the kind of things that we really need to have transformation of society, for example, in a green direction. The finance that does exist is too short-termist. It doesn't have that long-run kind of trajectory. But also, there really isn't enough vision of what we actually mean. And I love, what you've written also about this and what you just alluded to, which is the role of creativity in the arts in helping us actually imagine the future. Even the plastics, example I gave before, it's quite striking. At least, my kids, they all know about the plastic-free ocean, not because some minister talked to them about it, or some academic like me, but because they saw a really, really good program in the cultural sector about it. So David Attenborough's Blue Planet, that last episode with the baby dolphins choking on the plastic, has really rung a chord in the brains of so many kids and students across the world in schools. And that mission, that really inspirational mission of getting the plastic out, so these fish and different species underneath, the oceans can live and prosper just like we want to prosper as humans, has rung a chord because they saw an inspirational film about it. So the role of music, of philosophy, of poetry, of the arts could really allow us to reimagine the future and to help us frame those very missions. I think that's crucial. And unfortunately, it's what we're very bad at doing. So anytime you think of mission orientedness, like I was saying before, the risk is you just bring a bunch of elitists, academics, businesses, policy organizations coming to the table and then lecturing to everyone of what's going to be good for them. Carbon neutral city, we must have that. And of course, I would agree we need a carbon neutral city, but it's not going to happen. We can't catalyze as much new thinking, creativity, new types of solutions from different spheres, but even how we frame that problem needs to have those different voices at the table. Coming back to the trade union point that we began with, this is a very important point with trade unions today, because as we move towards a green transition, there will be many sectors where people are working that might be, disappearing, or people actually being left behind as their skills become less relevant. And so there's a whole movement called the just transition, making sure that people, so workers, are actually invested in order to transit towards a cleaner, greener economy. And that's very good. However, one of the arguments I make is those voices, let's just call it labor's voices, workers' voices, but also just diverse voices, students and the green movement and social movement and feminists should be at the table ex ante, not just ex post. Ex ante meaning even before, to design, to think about what is green. You shouldn't just have to fight to make sure the transition is just. And that's what I mean by stakeholder governance. But just coming back to your point, this is the moment to make sure we have a Green Deal on both sides of those two words. Green, meaning a green direction towards the investments. So if we just have a build, 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 build mentality, Boris Johnson's talking about build, 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 without a green building, a green design, a green thinking of the future of mobility and clean growth, that's a massive lost opportunity. But the word deal is just as important. And I actually think there's more attention right now on the green bit than the deal, and they both need equal amount of rethinking. The deal literally is the social compact, and that has to do, with things like the conditionalities. But also, I wrote an article in the New York Times last week about this, about rethinking the distribution of the rewards from these investments. So you might have a lot of public investment in an area, you can call it the New Deal, but if then the distribution of the rewards from those investments just go to the 1%, or even just to the private sector and not more openly to citizens and other organizations, that's a problem. And so I wrote about the notion of a citizen's dividend or public wealth fund being structured so that it's not just through taxation that we distribute. That's very important, also through taxation, but also through new institutions that really represent this collective wealth creation process. So if we create wealth collectively, let's make sure we also, socialize that wealth creation. And that doesn't mean socialism necessarily. It just actually means making sure we even have a narrative and a framing of where does value actually come from, and how do we make sure we socialize both risks and rewards. And things like wealth funds or citizen dividends or stronger conditionalities attached when the public sector comes into a sector to make sure that what the sector does actually helps society instead of hurting it. Those are all the different ways that you could rethink the deal.
And you were actually mentioning in this piece, in the recent piece in the New York Times, which I read, that Alaska has a model in place for such a citizen's dividend, and that it has actually been successfully addressing inequality. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Alaska, it's countries also like Norway, say, with its sovereign wealth fund, right? So this is returns that are being earned from a public resource that then goes into a fund that can either be used for, pension payments, but ideally also for something more ambitious in terms of reinvesting what's coming from a common source so reinvesting it back into areas that we know are very important for citizens. And the citizens themselves can both get a share of those returns as income. So instead of talking about universal basic income, you could think of it as a basic share of the wealth you helped create. But also, something that I'm thinking about with someone called George the Poet, who's one of the most inspirational people I'm currently working with, George Mapanga. I recommend you all go to George the Poet's podcast. We've been talking about how can you, think about new ways to distribute wealth in communities, like say in London, there's many neighborhoods which a lot of value is created, for example, by young Black artists, so rappers, but a lot of that value then gets siphoned out. In fact, the whole rap industry, if you think about it, is a billion, if not trillion-dollar industry, and yet those funds are not reinvested back into the very sources that are so important for the people producing it, at least early on, in terms of good social housing, youth centers, art centers that the artists actually require. So the big picture point of that piece in the New York Times was, and again, you could bring it to a community, a neighborhood, or to a country like Norway or a state like Alaska. How can we think up new institutional structures which are able to kind of capture, govern the wealth when it's created, so it's reinvested back into the very communities that require to be nourished and have new capabilities and opportunities available to them in order to be active, capable, creative members of society. So it's really kind of about value creation versus value extraction, and the need for new contracts, new cooperative models, new, mutualistic ecosystems versus parasitic ones.
Yeah, that's why the value of everything, your book, is more relevant now, I think, than ever before. It's such an urgent book for the current moment. And I was wondering, talking about inequality, talking about the Green New Deal also, you had conversations also with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, actually, on ways how a more active industrial policy might actually catalyze a Green New Deal. Can you tell us about these conversations?
Yeah, so I began speaking to her before she became a congresswoman. So that was great. I went to Queens and we sat in a wonderful little cafe. I have pictures of it. You should put up that picture, but you don't have it. I'll send it to you later. So this was about 2.5 years ago. She had read some of my work. And what was interesting is we talked just as much about health as we did about green. And, you know, health now is, of course, you know, we're clapping our healthcare workers because we realize just how essential healthcare and health services and health innovation is really. And the reason we were talking about health initially is that this is definitely a sector where, you know, it's not a lack of money. It's the very problematic structures that we have, which then don't deliver the outcomes we need. So in the US, which is, you know, she's a congresswoman in New York City, the US state, so the taxpayer, the government spends over $40 billion a year on health innovation, and yet then doesn't structure the relationship with the private pharmaceutical companies in a way that actually gets us both the kind of drugs we need in terms of the direction of the research, but also the conditions. So patents, intellectual property rights are completely abused, and the prices of the drugs themselves don't actually take into account that public contribution. So she, on the back of the conversations we had, actually organized a hearing around these ideas. I had actually participated with Elizabeth Warren, who brought me in to do some testimony in the Senate a couple of years before that on this very issue. How can we structure health innovation towards kind of public value and public purpose, given how much public money goes into it? And we moved from that then to the Green Deal. And what I suggested to her around that was to make sure that it was really ambitious, that it was not just green infrastructure, but really about greening the entire economy. You know, every single sector can be greened. In fact, in Germany, are you from Germany?
Switzerland.
Switzerland, sorry. I'm terrible with all those Northerners, they're all the same, just kidding. In Germany, it was quite interesting with their own version of the Green Deal and Energiewende. There was conditions attached with the public loans that were being provided by the public bank to the steel sector. They had to lower their material content in order to receive those loans. This is pre-COVID. And that's what actually really fostered innovation within steel. They had to come up with ways to repurpose, recycle, reuse within the whole value chain. And, you know, thinking about how to green, how to render more sustainable all sectors throughout their whole value chain has to be part of the Green Deal, but also thinking just as much about the supply side as the demand side. Much of the New Deal that you were talking about was also changing how people perceived, as we were talking about the future, the role of the arts very much doing that. That affects what people want. People don't just wake up with taste preferences, as economists like to pretend they do. These very kind of preferences, what we think is good, what we think is the good life itself, can be shaped by kind of rethinking, whether it's good or not to be a couch potato, for example. And so rethinking demand, but also literally through things like procurement, which I was mentioning before. So government as purchaser, but also much bolder than that in terms of kind of new ways of thinking about literally what is the good life. And of course, also the concept of the just transition, how to make sure that, you know, someone as progressive as herself also has a real strategy of thinking how all the people who are currently working in problematic industries that are still based on fossil fuels, and you could call them, you know, brown, not green industries, how will they transition? So real investment in human capital, I don't like that word, but anyway, training, retraining, reskilling, but also giving people time to do that. You talked about long-termism before. People need long-termism. It takes time to learn. That's where these ideas of the universal basic income and citizen shares are quite useful, because as you transit, you might just actually need quite some time to develop the skills or the rethinking what you want to do in this new type of society, and we can't kind of rush that process. So again, thinking of it as a as a economy-wide change, not just about renewable energy, how we need to bring new voices to the table, from artists to, again, labor to social movements to the table to reimagine that future, but also the very practical investments that are required, both on upstream, but also downstream on the demand side, rethinking of procurement kind of contracts, that whole array of different possibilities that are there to steer the economy. That also requires the different narrative of what policy is for. And that's where a lot of the pushback comes. So she'll be accused, as will Ursula von der Leyen, that, that's not the role of a politician. You should just level the playing field and let the market decide where to go. And, one of my messages has been, you need a new theory, a new practice on how to tilt the playing field, because you're not going to get a green revolution just leveling it. We didn't get the internet revolution by leveling the playing field. Lots of different investments had to occur, and that kind of lesson. And lastly, this New York Times article that I wrote was something I spoke to her about, the key issues in that, which is, what are the different mechanisms that you need to make sure that when you make these investments, you don't do it in a naive way. And by that, I mean, if you look at the US government under Obama, they talked about a green transition, but then they made all these investments in companies like Tesla, which received a guaranteed loan of $465 million, Solyndra, $500 million. But the government had to bail out the one that went bankrupt, Solyndra, and the success, Tesla, was then narrated as a private sector success, Elon Musk. And so really admitting that the state has had to be an investor first resort, an investor, a risk taker, not just a facilitator and market fixer, requires thinking about things like portfolios. How do you make sure that you're not just bailing out Solyndra, but getting some of the upside from Tesla? I can tell you more about how that went wrong, but I feel like, again, I'm talking too much. But that does require, again, rethinking, how do we socialize the rewards to these massive risk-taking public investments, whether it's through equity or something else, to make sure that, it's not just about kind of handing everything over to a small set of actors.
And thank you so much. That's such a great answer. And I thought, because you mentioned, bringing artists at the table, this is a good moment to bring in some of the questions I received for you from artists. And we have questions from Diacron, from Ben Vickers and Brian Eno. I wanted to begin with Brian because he brought us together. Brian is sending you his warmest regards. And here is his question. He says, it's notable that many of the most interesting new economists, you, of course, Mariana, Kate Revers, Carlota Perez, and many others, are women. Brian wants to know what different perception of value are women bringing to the discussion.
That's a hard one. So I could talk about those people, and they are women. I'm not sure it's because they're women, but it's interesting. I have 3 daughters, and they all go to a school here, a state school called Camden School for Girls, and they are absolutely feminists. Even the boys who go to Camden School for Girls are all feminists. And I think one of the point, I think, with this different perspective that women bring to the table, I hate to say it because it's going to sound a bit flimsy, but it's also about being more humble, listening, interacting. I mean, the problem that I mentioned in the beginning when I was talking about why, I went to economics and the lessons I learned from one of my old professors about how economists almost already know what they want to prove and then backtrack and ask, what is the method, the technique that's going to allow me to prove it? So the opposite of the scientific method. I think, at least from my experience, women, and again, I don't like to generalize too much about women and men because there's been also terrible women leaders, as we know, is maybe it's because of the need to be doing a lot of different things at the same time, from bathing a child to sending a fax, even though we don't send faxes anymore, to cooking and answering the phone at the same time. But there's something about, at least my experience, women kind of pausing, listening, observing, as opposed to just talking, that kind of mansplaining thing, and then asking, okay, what are we going to do to solve that problem? And that's a very useful, ability to have, let's just call it empathy, in science and a social science like the economy. And so definitely, if you think of Kate's very important work around the circular economy and how she's working with cities, she doesn't just go to Amsterdam and say, all right, guys, this is what you're going to do. And I'm so smart. Listen to me. And otherwise you're stupid. She works patiently, slowly, listening to the civil servants in the city. Carlota Perez, who is a very, very good friend of mine, so is Kate. She is a Venezuelan economist and historian, probably one of the best historians and / economists that I know. She's done very patient work in the sense of looking over long periods of history, literally, hundreds of years, the different phases of economic development and the relationship between finance and the productive kind of sectors, so in the real economy and government policy, and understanding the relationship between big technological revolutions, trajectories, and the role of private and public kind of investments in the financial sector within that. And just that patience of looking at the data, looking at the history, almost too much. I always say to her, come on, speed up, you have too much to write. You can't keep reading. But she's so humble. She knows more than anyone I know, but she continues to read because she thinks she needs to learn to pay attention to the context, not just to profess. And I think if you look at the women economists that Brian has mentioned, it's that they were patient, humble, willing to listen, willing to read, what actually happened in a place as opposed to my idea of what should happen. And there's too little of that. But I do know some men who have that. Does my husband have that? I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, my friend Ete Latnan, the poet and artist, the visionary poet and artist, she always said the 20th century was maybe more about manifestos, but the 21st century should be about listening. So it's very fascinating.
Yeah, but no one's born with the ability to listen. So in writing this curriculum that we're writing for civil servants globally, I keep thinking we should have like one class called Empathy 101. How do you listen? It's an art. My husband, when he used to make documentaries, he's a film producer. He focuses now more on feature films, but he had brought in, I remember, an anthropologist, I can't remember her name, who wrote a book called The Art of Listening to work with his documentary makers, because he said, you need to know how to listen to do a documentary, and don't assume you know how to do that. It's a skill. So any skill needs patience, a certain number of hours to learn how to play the piano. You need a certain amount of hours to think, how am I going to really listen, as opposed to talk like I'm doing now with you. Talk, 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 talk.
No, it's been really fascinating. And we have more questions from artists here. Diachron, an artist group from Denmark. And it's interesting because you mentioned Denmark before. Yeah. We can actually learn from Denmark. They want to know more about the deep risk you mentioned. That's, of course, something you mentioned in the entrepreneurial state, the risk governments take. Their question is, what tools could allow the public sector to run ventures into the next cycle of deepest societal risks?
So let me break that down. The first is to admit that you'll have to take risks, which means welcoming uncertainty. Uncertainty is even bigger than risk, right? Risk, the difference between risk and uncertainty, if you're interested in that, there's a very good book written in 1921 by Frank Knight. So risk, you can actually do a probability distribution around it, right? So the probability you win the lottery, 1 in a million. Uncertainty is, will your wife or husband leave you? I don't know, maybe. You can't actually do a probability distribution around that. Or the, will an innovation, will the investment in a new medicine or a new technology succeed or not? It's just purely uncertain. Will you win the war? It's uncertain. So uncertainty is much deeper actually than risk, because risk can be quantifiable, uncertainty can't. And so much of the innovation that's driven the big shifts in our society have actually come from very, very uncertain processes. In fact, most innovations came about often by chance. Viagra, was actually meant for the heart, and then this other thing popped up. You're all supposed to be laughing now. That's very common, right? So search for one thing leads to the discovery of something else. And if, capital I, if we want government to do what it did for all the technologies that are in our smartphones, internet, touchscreen, Siri, Siri, touchscreen display, GPS, etc., that required risk-taking by government institutions, then we have to admit that government might every now and then make mistakes, right? So any venture capitalist, if you speak to them, they always brag about all the risks they took. And yes, then they massively succeeded. So Kleiner Perkins, a venture capital company, failed, but then invested in Genentech, a biotech company, made huge amounts of money. They brag about that risk taking. Whereas when a civil servant makes a mistake, doesn't succeed, it's in the front page of the newspaper, right? And they're told to step back and government sucks and you should just, do the horizontal conditions, level the playing field, and then get the hell out of the way. Had government thought like that, we wouldn't have gone to the moon, and we wouldn't have the technology in our iPhones, and we wouldn't have most renewable technologies because solar and wind came from government risk-taking. So that's the first thing, to admit government has to also mess up a bit if it's going to be a risk taker and an innovator. And we have to be willing to accept that. The second point, though, which comes to the question is, what does that mean then in terms of how you set up a portfolio? So instead of picking one technology, one sector, one kind of firm, what you really need to be picking is a direction. That comes back to my missions point. If you want a green transition, you're gonna have to pick that and make it happen. Within that, you'll have a portfolio of different investments. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You don't just do offshore wind or solar. You will be investing in lots of different areas within the kind of, let's just call it renewable space, of which some might fail, some might succeed, right? So again, wide set of different types of investments within, though, a set direction. And that's the third point, is the point I was making about Tesla and Solyndra. What we're not good at doing then is making sure that you, A, welcome the failure, but make sure you're not just, having to cover the failure, but also getting some of the upside from the successes. And this is where Obama got it wrong. He said to Elon Musk back in 2009, if you don't pay back the loan we give you to Tesla, we're going to get 3 million shares in your company. And why you would want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back its loan is beyond me. Had he said, we get 3 million shares in your company if you do pay back the loan, and they did pay back the loan in 2013, the price per share went from something like 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss, and then the next round of investment. And the last point is, in terms of the next round of investment, what you're investing in, well, you better make sure it's not the fire, finance, insurance, and real estate, but that kind of constantly pushing the new frontier of what's required also for making citizens, have greater opportunities. So the sovereign wealth fund that I mentioned in Norway is problematic precisely because, yes, it is a public fund. It does bring back a share to citizens, but unfortunately, it's been investing in pretty problematic areas like a lot of global real estate. So there's been a lot of pressure inside Norway to steer that fund towards, areas that could really expand how we might be living in a more sustainable planet in the future. But all four of those areas, a narrative of government as a risk taker, setting up a portfolio wide across risks, admitting that you're going to be making some mistakes along the way, but also making sure that what we're reinvesting in from that portfolio is kind of towards the common good, and these kind of, siloed financialized practices. All those need to be unpicked.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Ben Vickers and Victoria Ivanova. So more questions here from artists who work with technology. They wanted to ask you the following. Much of your work, Mariana, concerning economics, attempts to make sense of the new regulatory frameworks required for emerging innovation. One area where this is a concern is the development of blockchain, a technology that seemingly emerged from nowhere. A decade after its initial creation, we are seeing vast experimentation with many implications, creating potential for entirely new forms of decentralized organizing of society and of finance. But adoption and integration of this technology is minimal, near non-existent. Do you think this will change? And based on current design principles, who will be the winners and losers? So it's a question about blockchain.
That's a very good question. So I'm not an expert on blockchain, but I'll give my answer and then you can decide if it makes any sense. So first, let me just take the bigger question, which is the future of technology, artificial intelligence, big data, and blockchain together. The first issue is kind of where the question finished up with, which is how do we govern that, right? So these technologies, again, have often come, as I've been saying, from all sorts of different investments. And the fact that governments have been one of the lead investors actually in the whole AI revolution, but then didn't govern that process properly is one of the biggest failures of our time. And it's very interesting how some cities and countries are trying to rethink that. So the city of Barcelona, for example, actually brought in a team of hackers. So Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, hired hackers to come into the city government to make sure that the city itself was more able to even navigate this whole space of kind of new technology, to make sure that citizens living in the city were benefiting from the data that's actually being created every time someone clicks on Citymapper. So instead of that data just going to a private company, it comes back to a data commons, which improves public transport. That's just an example of the issue of how we govern the distribution, but also what it's for requires political will. A second point with blockchain in particular, I mean, one of the things I find very interesting with blockchain actually has to do with my book on value, because in the book on value, I talked a lot about rent. And I argue that one of the features of modern day economies is we don't even know how to distinguish value creation from value extraction. And lots of the value extraction happens through intermediation activities, which are basically just moving stuff around, not really creating anything new. And I call that rent, like the classical political economists, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, and Karl Marx, the unearned income. And so that means that even in GDP, we actually confuse rents and profits, because GDP can be done in different ways, including by income. And if we don't know the difference between rents and profits, we end up actually filling it up with a lot of rent activities. So we shouldn't just, add happiness indicators, but first take out the rent. Anyway, blockchain, one of its key features is it can get rid of a lot of the intermediation. That's one of its possibilities, that it allows us to decrease the level of intermediation in the economy because of literally the underlying technological structures of blockchains do that. And one of the questions I think, I haven't seen anyone really answering is, what are the potentials for blockchain to allow us to govern, in some ways, our capitalist system, but also you could do it sector by sector, to reduce the level of intermediation, so to reduce rent, which would increase the amount of kind of real value creation and funds from real value creation, not rent extraction. But then again, you would have to govern that system to make sure that that fall in rent, fall intermediation is then actually going to productive purposes. And anyway, so that could have both an effect at the macroeconomic level. Again, if we actually looked at the amount of rent in GDP and actually using blockchain technology to allow us to see how would GDP itself change if we reduced that intermediation, but also sector by sector. I mean, definitely in the health sector, there's huge amounts of intermediation, and the degree to which blockchain can help us really govern that sector to really create value in more direct ways would be interesting.
Thank you. Then we have more questions. One question from the audience, from the DLD audience. How can we recognize or account or claim the value of culture in capitalist societies without reducing it to impact metrics? It's a question of value. And then there is another art-related question which relates to that, and which is of particular interest, I think, also in relation to some models from the 60s, like APG by John Latham and Barbara Stevini, where basically artists have thought about this idea of how we could actually bring art into society. How can we bring artists into industry and government? John Latham and Barbara Stevini in England in the 60s had this wonderful organization where they placed artists in government and in society. So the question is, of course, what it is that the art field needs to understand in order to play more, in a way, a more integrated role in these developments, because many of these projects actually haven't then taken off. Artist Placement Group later on remained an unrealized project. So what would need to change to make that happen?
Very interesting. So the first question on metrics, one problem is what we're not measuring, and another problem is why are we always just measuring everything? What are other ways, even just conversing and dialogues and getting deep into the, I talked about uncertainty, case studies, kind of immersing yourself in the granularity of really understanding something without having to come up with a metric. And I think we need to do both. We definitely need better metrics. And one of the fundamental problems in economics, which I talk about in my value, is that we've confused value because we've confused price with value. So we only include in GDP what has a price. And so if you marry your babysitter, GDP will go down. If you pollute, GDP will go up. I won't explain that. That's your little Sudoku of the day. And so then the question is, do we need something besides price to go into, how we value outputs goods and services in the economy, and of course we do. And this whole COVID crisis has brought us to talk about things like essential services or key workers. So the health workers themselves, it's not just that we need to be putting more money into our NHS, we need to know how to value the NHS. And currently, because we confuse price with value, we only know how to put the costs of the services, right? Because there's a price to it. There's a cost of a nurse, a cost of a doctor, a cost of a hospital, beds, the cleaning equipment for it. But the value that's created from a service that's publicly available, like in the UK where we're very lucky, very, very lucky to have a public health service, we don't know how to value that. Same thing with school. We know how to value the cost of the school teachers, but not the value of a well-structured, ambitious, creative, dynamic public education system. And that's hugely problematic. It means you also get a tautology. So you have, big financial investors like, say, the Goldman Sachs head, Lloyd Blankfein, famously in 2009 said that Goldman Sachs workers were the most productive in the world. This was just a year after the bank got bailed out, $10 billion by the US taxpayer. But he was right, because how we measure productivity, which is output per input, for a sector like investment banking, there's costs and prices to the output and to the input. We know how to do that. So you can physically, accountingly, look at productivity in investment banking, and it looks really productive compared to, say, public school teaching. But that's completely false. That's just because of what we've decided to price and how we allow certain prices and incomes to rise more than others. So it becomes this kind of tautology. And, in sociology, there's this concept of performativity, which is that how you measure the performance of something then also affects how that something behaves. And that feeds back into how you think about it and how you measure it. So it's this really vicious cycle. We need to get out of that. And that means really proper metrics to be valuing all these things that we think are essential, but not bringing it down to just one metric. We need hybrid metrics, but also stories and narratives and framing, also resources following that for something as important as health services. On the artist question, I don't know, I feel like you need to answer that. It's a big question. And one of my best friends here in London is Cornelia Parker. And in fact, let me see, I can move my computer around. That's one of her paintings. Do you see it? Oh, God.
Oh, yeah, amazing, amazing.
You also see my dirty room here. I also have this nice, I should show you my art. This is Mariana Mazzucato. Anyway,
wow. It's great about Cornelia Parker because she, of course, is also so involved. I actually spoke with her once in Gustav Metzger about environmental art. She has been for a long time very involved, very committed and important for that.
Exactly, but that's what I wanted to come to. She, but also Anthony Gormley, who also lives nearby, we used to meet actually every now and then around this question of artists and kind of the green transition, the Green Deal. And I think there's, and also with Kumi Naidu, who, as you know, is head of Amnesty, the idea that, he's also been thinking about is how do we bring artists to the table to also kind of really, shake up a bit the cultural sector to make it really part of the both storytelling and the reimagination of what society can look like if we, really, again, steer it in a completely new direction. And I think there's a tension with some artists thinking, well, the best that we can do is, more on that kind of reimagination side, and others who might be more about, let's actually talk about green, much more direct. And I think there's a bias. It's a wrong bias, in my opinion. I'm just an economist, so what do I know? That somehow political art isn't really art, right? That somehow you have to get to the politics and to this whole kind of transition idea indirectly. Because if it's too direct, it's going to be kind of cheap, right? And artists should just be about, the kind of big picture and not something as specific as let's move towards a Green Deal. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because in the end, obviously, it depends. There's good and bad on both sides of that. But surely we don't have today, at least I don't live it as an economist or a citizen. I don't live the arts community as a radical community that is pushing for change, maybe as the Bauhaus movement did at the time. I don't even know where the movements are. And they're not communicating with us. So I, as an economist, will write in The Guardian, or in the Financial Times or the Corriere della Sera or Valor in Brazil about my opinion about why things are messed up and why we need a new approach. Unfortunately, I don't know if it's because there's not enough commissions from the newspapers or what, but you don't really hear in the non-specialist journals and magazines and outlets that you guys have, I don't hear the arts world talking about change. And by the way, the architects, I think, are the worst. I mean, I don't know where you live. I live here in North London. We had the whole Granary Square, redevelopment. I know that was very controversial, but there was hardly ever any articles by the architects saying, hey, no, there's a different way to do this. In the same way that economists are constantly, maybe too much, saying, no, don't do that, do that. So I think part of it is a challenge that I would say to the artists. So I don't talk about art because I don't know anything about art, but my challenge to the artist community would be, come on, guys, get out there, fight the fight in channels that we understand as well, which is not just through your art, but if there's a movement, think of it a bit more participatory so we can understand what the big questions are, at least in the arts community, for the kind of changes you see. I mean, I know, for example, the commercialization of art through markets like Frieze, I guess that's a bit controversial. I don't know if it is or not. I don't hear much of that. I just hear about it through dinner table conversations, not in the public domain, in the public realm, to debate the role of art in the 21st century.
But it's exactly because of that we, launched this project with the Serpentine of having 50 artist campaigns, environmental campaigns, which go outside the museum into society. So we'll send you information on that, and hopefully we can have a dialogue. And I think in terms of architecture, I mean, David Adje, who is advising our pavilion, talks about the importance of, new social architecture movement, and our pavilion project with the social architecture of counterspace will evolve over the next 18 months. So we send you information on all of that. We have more.
Do you know that Olafur Eliasson and I, so we were actually just last night, but he and I actually met because we were both saying something similar, but in a different way. So I always say the role of the state shouldn't be to fix markets, but to actually co-create and co-shape markets. And that requires a new vision of the public sector as doing more than just doing what the private sector is not doing. And he had written something that public space, like the public realm, should not just be the doormat of private space. And we really need to reimagine public spaces as places where we're also feeling safe to disagree. And that the public spaces that we do have in our cities are just very small and kind of between different private spaces. And I think that's also an area that we can work together more, the public realm, seen from kind of an arts lens, and from, economists like myself who really believe in rethinking the welfare state and the public realm on the economic side. We should be talking more together. And also Amanda Levitt, I invited her to give a talk. She's the architect who designed the courtyard of the V&A. Yeah. She gave a great talk for one of our series on the public realm. She said the fact that the finance for the materials that she used, literally the tiles, the paints, the stones for that square, that it came from the public sector, gave her much more time to think and to experiment. So your point about the long-term vision, long-run vision you need with the New Deal, that long-termism, to experiment, to learn, to do the trial and error, she had with that project, which she hasn't had with certain projects which really create a lot of rush for her as an architect because there's a financial profit and return that needs to be earned in a short amount of time.
Yeah, so I hope talking about long duration, this is the beginning of many more conversations we can have. So thank you so much. We have a few last questions from the DLD here from the participants. So one is about context we haven't addressed yet, because we spoke about several countries we can learn from, and someone wants to know here what strategies should basically countries like South Africa adopt to deal with deep structural problems of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And then also another question from the DLD community is about Brazil. You've, of course, quoted Brazil quite a lot. I saw in articles also in relation to previous texts. There's, of course, now a dramatic escalation of the Amazon deforestation. So the question here from the audience, it seems like the lack of economic alternative has contributed to the situation. How could capitalism be rebooted? And how would it converge towards a more inclusive and sustainable path?
This is the last two questions are huge. We were supposed to finish at 1:30. I have another event where they haven't seen me. Hopefully they're not texting me because my phone is off. So, great questions. Let me just answer both quickly. First of all, I'm actually advising the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, and his advisory council. And I found it fascinating. Again, a real opportunity to learn, not just to profess, as we were saying before. And one of the things I'm really learning there, which is so important, is a lot of what I talk about is, again, the role of the state to be not just fixing markets, to be more entrepreneurial. But in a country like South Africa, they have a version of that in terms of just state ownership of stuff. And that's not what I'm talking about. Just because you have a state-owned enterprise, if it's not driven by strong kind of metrics around public value, like the BBC, by the way, which is one of the most interesting. I just ran a workshop with the management of the BBC this week. It's fascinating around their concept of public value. If you don't within have metrics, structures, organizational culture, portfolio thinking around the public good, then just because you own as the state an industry like energy, Eskom is the big state-owned enterprise for energy in South Africa, that's not going to be good enough, right? You need to restructure your own way of thinking about state ownership in order to foster, really ambitious goals, again, around kind of the SDGs. So lowering inequality, increasing sustainability, increasing the real opportunities for all people in a country to prosper, as opposed to have so much value extracted out of the elite. So there's a lot of inequality in South Africa. There's lots of value extraction in South Africa. And there's also, in some ways, a weak state setup. And Ramaphosa is very much, the president, interested in state capacity that I was mentioning before with the COVID crisis. COVID has really taught us that state capacity matters. And if you haven't been investing within your civil service in new ways to think about what the role is of the civil service and public ownership, and just get stuck in old ways, inertial ways that kind of just in some ways justify the status quo just with different names, then that's the problem. So countries like South Africa have really taught me how to engage with this issue of what happens when you have a weak state. Do you say, oh, forget it, you're just gonna, leave it all to foundations, private sector, nonprofits, or do you really invest also at the same time, and more so, in increasing the capacity of that public sector, not necessarily just making it bigger, but much more ambitious, able training programs, including ones that help us think through that portfolio set of questions we were talking about before. In Brazil, I mean, it's quite tragic, to be honest. Let's just be very, very honest, which is that this particular political regime in Brazil is problematic in all sorts of different levels, from what's happening in the Amazon, which should be called a crime to humanity, but also the vicious kind of murders that have occurred of people like Marielle Franco, one of the city officials in Rio, who was, apparently it had to do with Bolsonaro's regime. Again, I don't know it. I don't want to get too political in something like this, especially at the end, but there's been a big backlash against, let's call it, progressive politicians, progressive journalists, citizen movements in this regime, which is so intolerant to that kind of dialogue that we were talking about in the beginning. Countries prosper when there's debate, and if you can't have the debate because of a semi-dictatorship, that by definition is not going to be good for the country. And that's different, actually, from I think what Brazil has been experiencing in recent years. Lula wasn't perfect, Dilma wasn't perfect, but at least there was a huge ambition around inclusive growth. And in some ways, I don't think people realize this. Dilma was not impeached because she was corrupt, that there was no charge of corruption. She just spent too much money and didn't get the permission to spend that money by the Senate on education. Now, I don't want to defend any particular actions, but the point is, when you have such an ambition around reducing inequality and spending and all the kind of things like public education and different public welfare programs, they really did manage in a short amount of years to reduce inequality massively in Brazil. Now, could they have done it better? I'm sure they could have. Was there some corruption? That's not my area. I won't even talk about that. But the point is, ambition and a vision for change around inclusive growth, sustainable growth, innovation-led growth that actually is governed in a way that doesn't get abused. All those things are really important. It's what you and I have been talking about. and making sure that when we talk about countries, we are, again, humble enough to start looking at particular institutions in those countries and how we can make them better, whether it's a public bank like BNDES in Brazil, or the way that public and private interact. One of my good friends in Brazil used to say that Brazil is capitalism without capitalists, because there's so much inertia in the private sector. Being willing to both question both the public and the private sector and why there's inertia, and then thinking through what are the, not just policies, but ways to bring citizens and different voices to the table to create a shakeup in that inertia. I think that's relevant, but not just in those countries. It would be hugely needed right now in the UK, where unfortunately we seem to be quite stuck in our ways of building walls as opposed to welcoming new people.
Mariana, there could not be a more urgent conclusion. Thank you so much, and I hope we can continue soon. This was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
This was really amazing. I wish I could hug you both for this very, very inspiring and energizing talk. You're right, Mariana. Things are messed up and we need a new approach. You are both the role models for the new approach. I'm so happy and honored, and really got humbled too, listening to you. We all have to learn so much more. We have to be more engaged. And thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you so much.
Let's hug.
Let's hug.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Ciao.